What is literature? To me, it's an attempt to take the English language and find a new way to work with it, so you can say something new about the human experience. For instance, Virginia Woolf's The Waves. This is very clearly literature. This is 300 pages of stream of consciousness writing that follows 6 different people throughout the entirety of their relationships and their lives together. On the other hand, you have other books that are called genre books. These are just attempts to tell a really cool story, something that we can all latch onto and recognize and have a little fun with. For instance, What It Was. This is a great crime story. You can sort of feel that 70s atmosphere just leaking out of every page. It has a great tone. But for me, the best case scenario is when you take these two and combine them so that you're saying something new, something interesting, but you're also telling a great story along the way. Now, I've asked people to give me recommendations of genre novels that could also be considered literature, and some people tell me that's just not possible. Literature is always just too complex to really tell those cool crime and horror stories that we all love. And there's a few books that I always hold up that make them say, oh yeah, obviously, I was wrong. The most obvious example is The Road by Cormac McCarthy. This is his Pulitzer Prize-winning novel. It is an absolutely unique and beautiful story about a man and his son walking across America after some unspecified cataclysmic thing has sort of caused the apocalypse to happen. Now, it won the Pulitzer. The tone of voice is totally unique. This is very obviously literature. It says something really unique about love and humanity. It is also like one rotted corpse away from being an episode of Walking Dead. It's post-apocalyptic fiction. And so people look at it and say, yeah, if you recontextualize literature that way, it can definitely be considered a genre read as well. A couple more examples that are pretty obvious once you start thinking about them. A lot of Thomas Pynchon's books can be considered genre literature. Bleeding Edge is a story of an insurance investigator who's looking into shady money transfers and conspiracies in New York around the advent of 9/11. Yes, like Thomas Pynchon has won every award known to man. He is clearly one of the greatest authors of our time frame. This is also a detective novel. And I will absolutely fight anyone who says that American Tabloid is not the great American novel. Like, this tone of voice that James Ellroy has is absolutely unique. You feel like you're being punched in the face by these mid-level criminals and federal agents for 600 pages. The whole Underworld USA trilogy is an example of finding a totally unique way to find a really familiar crime story. And then in the course of that, revealing something really special about America and why it is the way that it is. Now, those are all really obvious examples. They're examples I pull up and people say, yeah, those are all examples of literature, which if you squint at them, could be considered genre reads. What I want to do next is share 4 genre reads that if you back up and look at them through a little bit different lens, could probably be considered pieces of great American literature as well. I said great American literature. The first one I'm going to hold up here is Damaged by Josephine Hart. This is the book I have bought the most copies of in my life because every time I give it to someone, I never get it back. This is a story of a doomed romance. It's a romance novel. But why I think this novel stands as an example of just great literature is the way that Josephine Hart gets into the character of this man who's gone through his whole life as kind of a shell, not even realizing that he's looking for anything in his life. And suddenly when he meets his son's fiancée, he realizes that she is the other piece to the puzzle that he's been looking for his entire life. There is an internal landscape, a geography of the soul. We search for its outlines all of our lives. Those who are lucky enough to find it ease like water over a stone, onto its fluid contours, and are home. That tone of voice never lags through the entire novel. It is very sad through the entire thing. You can feel this catastrophe coming and realize that these people are absolutely powerless to stop it. This is another book that I really liked. It's called Hold the Dark. It's by an author named William Giraldi. And what I liked about this book is the way that the cold itself becomes a character in the novel. It was made into a movie. The movie was fine, but it couldn't possibly explain how deeply you feel freezing cold while reading this entire novel. The main character in it is this wolf hunter, and this woman calls him and says, "Hey, you have to come and find the wolf that killed my child before my husband, who's been deployed overseas, gets home." And the further this hunter goes into Alaska, the more he uncovers the mysteries that surround this child's disappearance. And also, the more he understands just what it means to be out there with absolutely no safety net. No matter how far he goes, that people say, like, yeah, this is Alaska. And then he goes to a smaller town and they say, that town, that wasn't Alaska. This is Alaska. And he goes to the mining communities and the people who live in the trailers on the outskirts of those communities. And pretty soon you are so far into the wasteland that you feel like you can never get home and you will never get warm again. And to me, that personification of the cold, kept up at a sustained pace through this entire novel, makes it totally count as a piece of literature. The third of the fourth ones I'm going to talk about, Killing Them Softly by George V. Higgins. This was also published as Coogan's Trade. I just happened to have the movie tie-in edition. He also wrote a book called The Friends of Eddie Coyle, which a lot of people think is his best. That was also made into a really cool movie. And what makes these books into great movies is their use of dialogue. These stories are almost entirely dialogue. All that happens is a couple low-level crooks get into a room, and they gossip, and they talk to each other. And then they go to a car, and they gossip, and they talk to each other. They tell stories about other people that are running gambling, or assassination rings, or other criminal enterprises. And to me, that's what makes this count as such a unique piece. This really inspired me because there wasn't a whole lot of description in it. Instead, he just kept telling the stories that these crooks were telling to each other. And that use of dialogue to tell a story, I don't think I've ever seen anybody do it as well as George V. Higgins did it. And last, this is a book called Mongrels. It is by Stephen Graham Jones, and it is about a young boy who's living in a family of werewolves. But as yet, he hasn't turned yet. So he doesn't know, will I grow up to be a werewolf? Will I grow up to be a person? And you can read it in so many different ways. You can read it as a werewolf story, a new mythology of werewolves. You can read it as a coming-of-age story and how hard it is to grow up. Jones is also a Native American author, and you can probably read it as a story about how it feels to be outside this culture that you are living in and wondering how well will I adapt to that culture and how much will my ancestry actually define who I become as a person. So you can read it a lot of different ways, and you can also read it as literature because the language in this book, absolutely beautiful. It's telling a story, a coming-of-age story in a way that I've never really heard done this well anywhere else. And so that's why I think that this is a horror novel that could probably be counted as a great American novel as well, as a piece of literature. So if you're looking for that book that succeeds on every level, literature, genre read, something that's entertaining on one page and then really deep and mattering on the next, any of the ones that I talked about would be a great read.